In terms of designing UI interactions, xState is the best thing since sliced bread. It is absolutely imperative to make this library part of your front-end development toolkit, and by the end of this video, you will be convinced to do so. Here I have a view component, a form that can be used to add one or more items to a shopping cart. You can increase or decrease the quantity, you can enter the quantity directly, and of course you can add the items to the cart. This shows a confirmation message for a brief second, and then it goes back to showing the initial add to cart label. Also, if I alter the validation rules to make the validation fail, pressing the add to cart button will display the errors under the form. Then if I send a valid quantity, so let's say 11, press the add to cart button, the errors will be cleared and the items will be added to the cart. Anyway, we're going to create two components, one using xState and another one using a more traditional approach. Then at the end of the video, we'll compare the two and explain why xState is a zillion times better. So this is our starting point. We import the plus and minus icons. We define the props, which is a product ID, and quantity, where quantity has a default of 1. Then we have the template. And down here we also have some scoped styles for the input. Other than that, we have no functionality yet. So for xState, the first thing I'm going to do is create a new state machine. We'll do const add to cart machine equals create machine, and I'll import this from xState. Here we'll need to pass a configuration object where we'll have an ID, a context. This is the data we're working with, so we'll have product ID, which will be props product ID. We'll have quantity, and we'll also need something to store the errors, so we'll have an errors object. Then we'll need to define an initial state, which most of the times will be idle, meaning that the machine is not doing anything. And finally, we'll need to define a list of possible states. We'll have idle, which is our initial state. We'll have adding, which is when we are sending the HTTP request to add the item to the cart. And we'll also have recently added, which represents that short period of time when we show the confirmation message. Now that we have our states, we need to define the events that allow the machine to transition from one state to another. Let's start with idle. The events will go under the on key. We'll have update quantity and add to cart. So in this idle state, it will be possible to update the quantity and add to cart. The first event will execute an action. An action is like a side effect you want to happen. In our case, we want to update the quantity. So we'll do actions assign quantity. But we only want to do this if the provided value is at least equal to 1. We shouldn't accept 0 or negative values. So we can set a condition to something like min quantity. The nice part is that we don't even need to worry about these two right now. xState allows us to focus on figuring out the logic first and then work out the implementation details. Finally, we should set the event target. This is the state we want to transition to, and in this case we don't really want to go anywhere. We'll just assign the quantity and remain in the idle state. Now for the add to cart, we want to transition to the adding state. So we'll set target to adding. This adding state will invoke a service, which is basically the HTTP request we'll be making to add the items to the cart. So we'll do invoke, and this service will have an ID, which will be add to cart. It will have a source, which will be the same, and we'll also have on done and on error. On done represents the transition that will be made if our HTTP request succeeds, while on error represents the transition that will be made if our request fails. So if everything goes right, we'll transition to recently added. But if something goes wrong, we'll assign the errors we receive and then transition back to idle. So we'll do action, assign errors, and then target idle. Now for recently added, this state only purpose is to display the confirmation message for a brief second. So we'll do after 1000 milliseconds, we'll set the target to idle. However, while we are in this state, we should also be able to change the quantity. So I'll go back here and grab this, add an on key, paste that in, and we'll set target back to recently added. And we are done with defining our state machine. Now, the first reason to use xState was you can focus on flow and logic and leave the implementation details for later. The second reason is you can actually visualize the flow of your component. So I can grab this machine, I'll copy it, go to stately.ai/viz, paste it in, replace the props.productID with some ID, let's say 1, replace the quantity with 1, click visualize, and voila, this is our component flowchart. We start in the idle state where we can either update the quantity or add to cart. This will transition us to the adding state where if we receive some errors, we'll assign the errors and go back to idle. If the request is successful, we'll transition to the recently added state, and then after 1 second, we'll go back to idle. However, going through this made me realize something is missing. Here, on the error, we assign the errors, but there's no place in this chart where we clear the errors. Those errors should clear when we attempt to add the items one more time. So here, on the adding state, we'll need an entry action. So on entry, when we are entering this state, we should clear the errors. Let's hit visualize again, and here it is. So I'll add to cart, and when we are entering the adding state, we'll make sure to clear the errors if we have any. Then we'll go done. After 1 second, we'll be back to idle. Now, our example here is pretty simple. Just imagine how much more useful this visualizer is when you're dealing with complicated components with many more states and events. Super helpful. So I'll go here, and on adding, we'll add entry, and we'll clear the errors. Now that our flow is ready, it's time to move on to the implementation details. We'll basically need to write the code for all the actions, services, and guards we have. For that, we'll need to pass a second object as argument to our createMachine function. So here we'll have an object with actions, services, and guards. Let's go through our states and try to copy all the actions we have. We have one here, another one here, one here, and this is the same. That's it, I think. Let's paste them in and start implementing them one by one. Now, from what I can see, all these actions need to update our context data in some way. The first one assigns the quantity, the second one clears the errors, which basically means it assigns an empty object to the errors key, and the last one assigns the errors we get from the server. To update the context, xState comes with a function called assign. This takes in an object with the keys we want to change. So let's just do assign. I'll pass an object. I'll copy this and do the same for the others. Let's make sure we import the assign function from xState. And here we'll have quantity, which will be a function that will receive the current context as the first argument and the event as the second argument. We'll basically need to return the event value. So whatever value is sent with the event will be assigned to the quantity. Then for the clear errors, all we need to do is assign an empty object. For assign errors, we'll have errors. We'll receive the context and the event. And I'm not really sure what the structure of that event will be, so I'll just do console log. We'll come back here later. Now for the services, we only have that add to cart one. So let's grab it, paste it in. We'll have a function that will receive the context, the current context as argument. And then here we'll just make an access call. So Axios post to API / cart items. And we'll need to pass the quantity and product ID. So quantity equals context.quantity, and product ID is context.product ID. Finally, for the guards, we only have that min quantity guard. So let's copy it, paste it in. This will receive the context and the event. And basically we need to make sure the event value is at least 1. So we'll do event.value bigger or equal than 1. Apart from that assign errors action, our implementation is pretty much ready. To use the machine, the view xState package comes with the composition function. So we can do const state send service equals use machine, and we'll pass it our machine. So add to cart machine. Let's import the function from xState view. And now the state represents the current state of the machine. Send is a function we can use to send events to our machine. And service is the current interpretation of the machine. Let's start using the machine and then we'll figure out that assign errors action. I'll go here and we have the form. Here we can do @submit and we'll use the prevent modifier and we'll send the add to cart event. Down here we have the minus button, so this should decrease the quantity. On click, we'll send an event, and now we also need to send a value, so this will be an object. We'll have type, which will be update quantity, and value will be the current quantity minus 1. So we'll do state.context quantity minus 1. Let's copy this and go to our plus button, and this will do context quantity plus 1. Now here we have the input, and this value should be equal to state context quantity. And then here we'll add an onChange event listener that will receive an event, and we'll call the send method with type update quantity and value equal to event.target.value. But this will be a string, so we need to convert it into an integer. We'll do parse int, paste that in, and we'll set the radix to 10. Next up, we'll need to show the appropriate label for the button. To check the current state we are in, we can do state.matches and pass it the state. So if the state is recently added, then we'll check the quantity. So we'll do state context quantity is bigger than 1, then show products were added. Otherwise display product was added. Else display the add to cart label. And finally, we need to display the errors. So I'll go down here and say state context errors product ID. And I'll do a vif here. So if we have a product ID error, display it. We may also have a quantity error. And we may have a general unknown error. And let's test it out. I'll refresh the browser, open the network tab, increase the quantity, press add to cart. Here is our confirmation message. If we take a look at the payload, we sent in the correct quantity. Let's also try to reduce it. And we cannot go below 1, which is what we wanted. Let's say 11. Press add to cart. The correct quantity is being sent. Also, let's play around with the throttling. I reduce this to slow 3G. And no matter how many times I press the button, only a single request is being made. Let's turn this back on and make it so that the validation fails. So I'll go to cart items controller and say we need a minimum quantity of 10. So this will make the validation to fail. I'll open the console and reduce this to 9, 8, press add to cart. And this is the format. So we have data, and then we have response data errors. So let's try to translate this into our errors object. I'll go to our assign errors, and here we'll do data, response, data again, and we'll have errors. And let's set a default of an empty object, and we should also grab the status and set a default to 500. Now, hopefully this is correct. So I have response data errors and then status right here. I think it is. Let's just console log. So we'll do console log errors and status. Let's refresh, add to cart, and we have, yes, here it is. We have the quantity and the status of 422. Now here we can do something like let res, and this will be the returned object, or let's say result. And if the status is 422, so this is unparsable entity, which is the status code returned by Laravel when we have validation errors. So if we have validation errors, we'll do for let key in errors. And then here we'll do result of key equals errors of key of 0. Otherwise, if the status is not 422, we'll say result unknown equals to something went wrong. Please try again later. And finally, we need to return the result. Okay, let's test it out. Add to cart. So the quantity must be at least 10. And let's try a 500 error. So I'll just add an X here. Add to cart. Something went wrong. Please try again later. And that was our xState version of the component. Let's implement the same thing using a more traditional approach. I'll move a bit faster with this one since most of you are already used to this style of coding. So we'll need a quantity reactive value. So we'll do const quantity equals ref props quantity. Let's import ref from view, and we'll also need an error subject. We'll have an onSubmit function, and this will be a sync because we'll have an await Axios post API / cart items, and we'll send the quantity, which is quantity value, and product ID, which is props.product ID. Let's wrap this within a try catch. And here we can copy the destructuring from the xState version. And we'll also do this part, which will be errors.value. Errors.value. But we now have a naming conflict, so I'll do an alias here. And I think we're good. Let's test this out. I'll add an event listener here. So onSubmit, prevent, call the onSubmit function. We'll set this to quantity. So we'll have vModel quantity. Let's remove this. And let's also copy the errors from this template. And here we'll have errors product ID, quantity, and unknown. Let's test it out. I'll refresh the browser, open the network tab, press add to cart, and here it is. Our request is being made. Let's also make the validation fail. So I'll do min 10, press add to cart, and here is our error. Next up, we need to tackle the on submitting state. So if I reduce this to slow 3G, I can continue press the add to cart button, and it shouldn't be possible. So to avoid that, we need to create a boolean. So we'll do const is submitting, and this will be false by default. And here, before we make the request, we'll set that to true, is submitting, value equals true. And then after the request was made, we'll set that to false. And of course, before making this call, we need to check if is submitting. So if is submitting, skip the execution. And now, if I refresh, put the throttling back in, continue pressing the add to cart button, and only one request is being made, which is what we wanted. Next up, we'll need to tackle the plus and minus buttons. For that, I'll just go inside the template, and here on the minus, we can just check the quantity. -1 is bigger than 0, then we can decrease the quantity. On the plus button, we can just do click, quantity, and increase it. Let's test it out. And the decrease, we cannot go below 1, which is what we wanted. Add to cart, and we're submitting the correct quantity. Finally, we need to show the confirmation message. So for that, we'll go here and have an is recently added. And then we need to grab this and toggle it here. We'll say is recently added value equals true, and then we'll have a set timeout that will set that back to false after 1 second. Let's go in the template and display the confirmation message. We'll have is recently added, and if the quantity is bigger than 1, then we'll have products were added. Otherwise, we'll have product was added. And we'll have the default label, which is add to cart. Let's refresh the browser, open the DevTools, press add to cart, and here it is. Let's test it out with errors. And product was added is still appearing. That's because we need to do this part inside here. So this should only happen if the request has been successful. Here it is. Another thing we should do is clear the errors after each submission. So if I add here 11, this error should disappear. So back here, we should do errors.value equals an empty object. Refresh again. Here's the error, and it's gone. Another thing we missed has to do with the recently added state. So if I reduce this to slow 3G, I can continue pressing the add to cart button, but only one request will be made. However, if I press on the product was added, the request is submitted again, and it shouldn't be possible. So right here, we also need to include another check for, so if is submitting or is recently added. Skip the execution. And this is one of my main problems with doing things using the traditional approach. You are forced to think about everything at once. When you are building something, your focus is set on what that feature enables. What shouldn't be possible very often comes as an afterthought or in some cases as a bug report. And this is a great example. I was focusing on showing the success message and I completely overlooked that it shouldn't be possible to add more items while the success label is being displayed. If we go back to the xState version, we see that I didn't have to think about all the things the user shouldn't be able to do. I only focused on what should be possible, which is updating the quantity. Everything else is impossible by default. And this is a huge win. You no longer need to worry about avoiding all the other zillion things your user might do. The state you are in tells you exactly what things are allowed to happen. Everything else is simply ignored. Once you get used to do things in a certain way, it becomes quite hard to give up and try something new. Especially if that something new looks like more work, which is often how people perceive xState to be like. And that has some truth to it. xState does look like more work, but that's only on the surface. In reality, it makes designing UI interactions a billion times easier, cleaner, and most importantly, less error-prone. With xState, your component logic and implementation is no longer littered all over the place. They are kept separate. Here we have all the states, actions, and conditions, and down here we have the actual implementation. This allows us to focus on the flow of our components without getting distracted by the implementation details. And that was it for this video. Trust me, give xState a chance. It will be a bit awkward at first, but you will grow to love it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, share it, subscribe, click the bell button, all that good stuff. Bye.